I invite up the first speaker for side affirmative to open the debate, and it is Casey here. I just realized I'm also going to be recording for this one. Hi, YouTube. Surely drop a like and subscribe. Yes. Guys, if you're really doing no, I'm not doing that. That's beyond what I'm willing to do for the ABC. Sorry, Rob. But yeah, first half, whenever you're ready.
Too much. I feel like I'm missing something. Okay, that's not. Oh, it's. Okay. Okay, starting in 3, 2. Panel, when the United States decided to strengthen the domestic market they have on semiconductor production, that was really fucking bad for China, right? Because that meant that China had a significantly decreased capacity to flex its economic muscle and control over the United States, so that if the United States did something bad, like visit Taiwan, for example, China had like a significantly decreased capacity to warn the US not to do that by limiting their capacity to import semiconductors. This is probably going to be just as bad when the US comparatively increases their electric vehicle markets, but the difference is here is that China already has their foot in the door on electric vehicle production. They already have a huge capacity to maintain a monopoly on this industry, and it's just like evident in the way that this info slide is written, right? Because the reason that they are cutting the cost of electric vehicles is to increase their market share, because they are losing that grasp. The best thing that they can do in this debate is consolidate electric vehicle production. 2 questions then: why we get increased strategic influence globally, and why we get increased control in domestic markets. First question on what setup and what consolidation probably looks like. I'm going to run through this quickly. We think it just looks like mergers and encouraging the monopolization of this industry. We think it looks like having a pretty strong degree of state involvement in this process and giving these companies managerial structures via the state. We think it looks like there being some level of difference between the companies that produce parts for electric vehicles and the companies that actually produce cars, and we probably wouldn't expect total monopolies there. Second question on setup, on what the interests of China are. Very obvious via my intro, economic expansion. But more importantly, it's exercising economic influence, because we think China uniquely has an ideology of expansion, control, and growth because of the 100 years of humiliation. We think that, noting the geopolitical context here, when we think that there was increased conflict in production between the US and Western nations in general and China, that China has especially strong incentives in this debate to be competitive to the United States and other nations that align with them ideologically, economically, militarily. Finally then, what do we think the consumption of EVs looks like under status quo, and how is it changing? Obviously there's an increased demand for EVs, noting that it's just an environmentally good thing to do. They're becoming easier produced when we do more lithium mining, and that's able to be done at a greater scale. Note that this is especially true for Western nations, because there are stronger environmental movements in these nations, and because these individuals are now looking for cheaper vehicles at a larger scale. That is something that is going to have a large control of the market. We also think, obviously, just in the way this motion is written, there is increased global manufacturing because of this demand. Obviously, the only thing the difference is China has their foot in the door and has better capacity to maintain monopoly in this market. Okay, why do we get increased strategic influence globally? Note that this is a really bad problem for China right now. Noting in general the geopolitical conflict in the geopolitical context that I've told you at my introduction and my setup, which is pushing countries to pursue protectionist economic policy. That means that they are moving industries into domestic markets, strengthening their capacity to produce this, and we think that this is happening with electric vehicles. Why is this so bad for China in the context of electric vehicles? Obviously, it just means they have a reduced market share, which means the countries are now less dependent on them in the consumption of electric vehicles. Why is this true? Because when there is increasing global competition, it means that consumers are more likely to buy from domestic markets, because that was more immediately accessible, and when there was such a wide array of companies that produce electric vehicles, that is most likely to be the cheapest option when you don't get things such as like export or like global standard tax or whatever. Next, we think that competitors are now going to have like more shareholders from domestic markets, or there is like decentralized structure on shareholders because it is just like really difficult to invest, to like choose which electric vehicle company, is the best, and then you just like have to like diversify your shares. Okay, and then lastly, we think that smaller companies can only operate at like small profits to a very limited extent at the point their economies of scale are just really bad. Overall note here, the countries now just have the capacity to pull out of the electric vehicle market in China, which means that they are less dependent on them when they fuck up through China's interests. So, but then note here that that's like especially bad when you consider that the countries that are developing their electric vehicle markets are ideologically better options for a lot of Western consumers. This looks like Japan having a huge market in electric vehicles. This looks like the US having an increasing market in electric vehicles, which means that like countries such as Australia are more likely to turn to them in the coming years when our consumers want to buy electric vehicles, and the Australian government is more likely to like put like embargoes on like Chinese electric vehicles or whatever. We mechanize against this very clearly, and we tell you that consolidation makes companies better producers and sellers, therefore makes them infinitely more competitive in the global market. First reason for this is just economies of scale. When you have more technology, have more producers, you are able to sell things at a cheaper price. When you have a concentrated company, this is something that is really attractive for shareholders because you just expect that you are going to turn a lot of profit, so now you have a lot of increased startup costs. We think that you are able to share good technology that facilitates efficient production, and we think that you probably have the best supply chains because now you have collapsed them into one. What is the impact of this? On net, we think it's probably just cheaper electric vehicles, right? This is very critical in this debate because it means that you are able to push out global competitors, because in the first instance you have a capacity to set prices that are very low competitively because you are competing with companies that have only just started up in a very new industry in markets that don't necessarily have the structures to produce really cheap goods. So we think that to that extent, countries are going to be more dependent on China. Note that we weigh dependency at the top of this debate for every reason that I told you in my introduction. We told you dependency was the most important thing for China to be considering right now because of the geopolitical context that we are inhabiting. That because if they started losing control on market share now, not only was that going to be really bad for the capacity for that economy to develop and for them to be able to maintain their stronghold and to be a great power, it also decreased the capacity for them to make other nations dependent on them and to be able to influence the kind of foreign policy decisions that they make that extend out of their economic policy. This is especially true when you consider everything I told you at setup, that Western nations are most likely to be consuming these, so now Western nations are most likely to be dependent on them. Let me ground this, right? Because we think that in the context of Australia acting in ways that are in opposition to China's geopolitical interests, we think that empirically and factually China just does limit their the extent to which they import iron from Australia, which is really bad for Australia and pushed us to adopt a foreign policy of being more accommodating to China. That was probably really good for China because it means that they have less conflict in the region, they have better economic stronghold, and this is just an example of where they can have more influence and force countries to change their foreign policy in a way that was advantageous to them. That is great. Secondly then, why we get more control over domestic markets in this debate. The framing here is just that it's really difficult to regulate a fuck ton of companies, obviously because they're decentralized, because you have limited capacity to communicate with 300 different companies, and we think that you just have limited state involvement at the point the CCP just doesn't have 1,000 different I don't know, officials who can go out and consult with these 300 companies or whatever. The grounding here is just that means you have a limited capacity to control how much they sell their electric vehicles for, or what types of suppliers they use. Mechanism against that is just flipping all of that and telling you that now you have one huge company that probably has managerial structures from the state that can control how the operations happen. You probably have direct lines of accountability that say, we will arrest whoever is at the top of your management chain if you don't do X, Y, Z. That is really good for us because you can do more of everything I told you on that first substantive, which is increasing your control in a global market. Noting that companies are likely to opt into this anyway because the profit incentive to be a monopoly is huge for them. I'm so proud to propose.
Thank you very much to the first affirmative speaker for their final remarks, and when they're ready, I'd like to welcome the first speaker for side negative to begin their team's case in this debate. Here.
Sorry.
No, it's all good.
Open
Yeah, please.
Just jump over it.
Now that first negative is no longer structurally denying the podium, whenever you're ready, here.
Give me 1 second, that's all right. Claim all the benefits that they want on their side, but they have to prove why, even if they have more cars at cheaper and cheaper prices, why people are going to actually buy these cars, and why companies like America and Germany are going to let them in the first place. Note here that AF concedes that most people who are buying these cars are not from China. They are from the West, because generally people in the West have more money and more infrastructure to facilitate these electric cars in the first place. So what we tell you is that the West is just not likely to let China get the control that China wants, and then they can't claim the benefits they like. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on setup and what this actually looks like. Secondly, on why it's just likely that we're going to get things like tariffs and sanctions by the West to stop China getting this control. And thirdly, why it's just bad for EVs and bad for China and the cars they want to sell there. So a couple of things on setup. Firstly, what I already flagged, which is that like most people who buy the cars from China are just in the West and in these kind of countries. But what I want to note secondly is that these cars are all just produced via technology and via parts that are like made in the West. For example, in America and Germany, things like refined cobalt and to make electric batteries are produced in the West. A lot of electric car technology is made in the West. They rely on purchasing this technology from them. The third thing to note is that generally the need for electric vehicles has just kind of been met in order to have this monopoly. That is why this price cutting and etc. is occurring. The fourth thing to note is that we are talking about China here and not the CCP, and that China has a lot of incentives to also make sure that like its own people are well catered for, and that its own its domestic electric car setup is done well, so that people just like the government and are not getting screwed over and are more likely to just like continue not dissenting in China, which we know is something that they want. So that's just a thing to note there. On to the first point of substantive, which is just like why we are empirically likely to get tariffs and sanctions by the West. Note that we do this, we'll prove this in 2 ways. Firstly, just like what has already happened, in that the US and Germany have already just empirically condemned the formation of these conglomerates in China, and have threatened to do things like sanctions and tariffs, noting that like sanctions meaning that they just won't buy the cars that China produces in the first place. So a lot of their benefits are mitigated by that. But secondly, that they just won't sell this technology, or they'll sell it at much higher prices to China to make these things. Anyway, I'll go into the impacting of that a little bit later. And just noting here that like the West knows what China is doing, obviously they are going to fight back. We think this needs to be addressed very further. Secondly, just like this, it makes sense for the West to do it just logically, because one, China poses a lot of threat towards these nations in that they have pretty large car manufacturing industries in their own country, and that like 30% of Germany's economy is done through car companies like Volkswagen. But so it threatens their big companies, and it just kind of worsens their own global presence is just undercut by these Chinese firms. And at worst, they just, even if they're not being undercut, they at worst have to compete. We don't see why they have any incentive to not put a stop to this in general. So it makes financial sense for them to not put a stop to this. But secondly, just in terms of jobs, if the industry becomes much stronger in China, then the industries in these other countries just have to become smaller if China is saturating the market. Noting here that like 1 million people are employed in these industries in the US. So people lose jobs, and we tell you that just like political pressure in general is quite likely to make sure that these countries themselves put these tariffs. Thirdly, we tell you just companies get smaller, companies have lobbying power, companies don't want to get smaller. Noting here that it's also just on the ground people who are making these cars, but also just like people employed at these companies and things like branding, advertising, etc., etc. We think there is a lot of political capital and political power that people use to incentivize governments to do this. Fourthly, we just tell you like the precedent of imposing sanctions on Chinese conglomeration is just a thing that exists and a thing that people that these countries are willing to do again. For example, BHP and other mining companies lobbied to prevent like oil companies in China from conglomerating a few years ago. So we tell you that like Western countries have done this, have a precedent to do so, and would in this situation, one, because they threatened to, and two, because it just makes sense for them in every way. Fun other reason that I forgot about is that we tell you that like the market perceives this as unfair if China just like completely expands quickly. Note that this looks like accusing China of things like foul play. America's already done this. We tell you it's likely to occur. Cool. Going back. So why is this the most important thing in the debate and the thing that wins side negative of the debate? Firstly, we just tell you that like sanctions prevent sales towards the biggest market of car companies that AF has already conceded. As in, even if these companies are to get big and huge and like globally dominating, if no one is willing to buy from them because it is so much more expensive than buying domestic, we tell you why this is not in China's best interest. Not what they want anyway. Secondly, we just tell you that it's like expensive for consumers domestically in China because these companies, in having to like buy more expensive technology and things to manufacture these cars, it's more expensive for people in China to buy cars themselves. Noting that this is about China and not the CCP, they care about their consumers, they care about what the consumers want, so the consumers don't, hate them. Yeah, so we tell you this just like less cars sold domestically, not good. But also just things like if these companies are to like shrink because they're selling less, that means things like less, we have less jobs, more cars get dumped. If they want to talk about the environment, we think like a bunch of cars sitting there doing nothing kind of makes environmental impact. Anyway, at the end of that, what you should believe is that like these companies don't, countries like America and Germany don't want China to dominate this market. We think it's quite reasonable that they're going to take measures to stop this, and this fucks over the Chinese car companies in China and outside. Debate winning for us. Cool. Next thing we're going to do is just like why this is bad for electric vehicles in general and people who want them and developing them to make them better. Firstly, we just tell you that there's like less incentive by companies to move towards smaller markets, and that like big conglomerates capture majority markets. They want to go somewhere where they will get a lot of customer bases. And what this means is that smaller companies who don't have that kind of the money to do that will just like capture smaller markets because they know there is a gap in the market for them to catch. So these smaller markets just are able to be filled in this way. So secondly, we tell you that there's just like less competition and therefore like less incentive to get better. A few reasons. Firstly, we just have a few big firms. They can do things like act as cartels to raise prices themselves together. They have like incentive to do that. Because there's just like less chance of them being undercut by smaller firms if you just have like a few big monopolies. Note that they also just kind of want to juice up their market value because stocks and they want to make money, etc. Thirdly, we tell you that like if you just have a monopoly in a district, there is a lot less incentive for you to just have cheaper prices because no one has anywhere else to go, especially like in China and domestically. Thirdly, we tell you that it's just like harder to enter markets because of these monopolies for new companies who want to bring in new technology. They cannot compete. Noting that like there's less incentive for research as well, because if you are a new company, your main selling point is not that you can do something cheaper, but that you can do something better. Because you have new technology and new things to show. So if you are trying to enter a market with just like huge monopolies you can't compete with, you're less likely to get better cars and better technology by new companies who want to make this change. Anyway, fourthly, we just tell you that like if your government gives out subsidies to these electric vehicles, and we tell you you're just like more incentivized on our side to like come up with new technology to prove why you deserve these subsidies in the first place. It's less likely on their side. So proud of the game.
Thank you very much to the first negative speaker for their fine remarks and keeping our career clean. And I'd now like to move on to the second affirmative speaker to continue their use case, Kiki. Say like after this speech I might go okay, so we might have to do a quick mid-debate break. So, morning now.
The opposition has tried to tell us that they win this debate on the basis that Western companies are not going to want to engage with China with EVs, that Western companies are going to drive the prices of these Chinese EVs down, and therefore Western companies will not sort of allow this thing to happen in a good way for the CCP. Why does this fall apart? Because on the outside, what exactly we want is this driving down the price of Chinese EVs. What exactly we want is a highly competitive Chinese EV market that is able to have a competitive edge over these Western EV production markets because they have a greater manufacturing power, because they have a competitive financial advantage over them. So two questions in this debate. Firstly, which side of the House is able to get better claims for Western dependency on the CCP, and secondly, which side of the House allows the CCP to retain greater control over the EV market. So under this first idea of dependency, they tried to tell us that these Western Western countries aren't going to become dependent on the CCP because of a few reasons. First of all, they tell us that these Western companies don't want to engage with the Chinese EV market, and that the Western industry is motivated to do this because it is going to suffer at the hands of this Chinese EV market taking off. Why is this not true? We tell you first of all that these companies at the end of the day are just profit incentivized, and we think if we give them this mechanism in the Chinese market to maximize their production, to maximize and have a really efficient production and turnaround on the amount of EVs they are selling, that they're probably just really going to want to engage with that, regardless of what country they're from. But let's take the opposition at their best and say that these companies do have this ideological stance against China, that they do want to sort of retain some sort of market share. We tell you that they're still able to do that in a way that doesn't mean that they're going to be cutting China out completely. We think that as they said, these companies still manufacture certain parts of technology needed. These companies still are able to sell these parts to China, which means to some extent at least they are still going to be retaining some sort of control over this EV market. But why on the outside of the House then does the CCP get better outcomes? Because when we are able to sort of monopolize this industry, the CCP then is able to give the best the most efficient way for these companies to make money, right? They're able to give them the most efficient production lines. They're able to give them the most efficient way to produce these EVs, which is something that is attractive to these companies, something that these companies are going to want to engage in. They told us in our world, the worst case scenario that we would be facing is that these companies are going to fight back, are going to be doing tariffs and sanctions against these industries. We on the outside just don't even think that that's necessarily a bad thing. We think at the point where obviously there's going to be some give and take between the Western market and the Chinese production market on these EVs, we think that yes, tariff sanctions were something we were going to contend with, but at the point where like the CCP officials were going to be the ones overseeing negotiations, where the CCP officials were the ones who were like in the country and like overseeing these production lines, that China would be able to retain some sort of control and come to like an agreement which was profitable for both sides, which was like something which was beneficial for both sides, even if that meant having tariffs or sanctions. We told you at STAM like why we got this increased strategic influence globally, but like I'll go over that again quickly. We told you why like when we have this reduced market share that we see under status quo, we have such like a decrease in dependency of these Western markets for China, and when we're able to like merge all of these like production companies in China, we tell you that like we are able to get better supply chains, we're able to like share better technology, and through that, we are able to like use the economies of scale to just make like a more profitable industry that is attractive to these companies, and that is better for the CCP as a whole. The impact of that is that first of all, we get cheaper EVs, which allow us to push out competitors globally, right? Allow us to like be more competitive, and it forces these other global markets to become more dependent on China, right? While these companies who are investing in EVs in China are still able to make a profit and are still able to benefit from that. I just don't think that like something like Volkswagen is going to turn around and like stand on the ground for Germany over like making a huge profit on like the profitability of like production of EVs in China, right? We just didn't think that that was a realistic thing that was going to happen. Furthermore, we tell you that like that is so important in this debate, especially because China has such an ethos of control, because China is always like actively seeking out ways in which they can like exert this control over the West, make sure that they have dependency of Western markets on them. That won us the debate on dependency alone, when we were able to tell you that that was probably the most important thing that China would be seeking out in this debate, and that we were able to gain it best on the outside of the house. However, there was this second idea of like having control over this market, which I'll contend with now. I think they tried to tell us that like once again, like you're going to have less cars like sold domestically in China when we're like raising the price of these EVs, because like these Western companies are now charging more for the parts which are required to make these EVs in China. Why was that just not important? We told you like from both sides conceded that most of the people buying EVs are not from China. Most of the people buying EVs are from the Western market and probably are just willing to like cop having a bit more of an expensive car. But we also gave you mechanisms for why it was more likely these cars were going to be cheaper from China in the first place. But furthermore, we tell you that like they told us that like new companies won't be able to sort of enter this market with this monopoly like happening, and that means we lose out on better tech. I think first of all, like we just don't really care if new companies enter the market at the point that we're trying to control it, right? And at the point where a company is coming out and telling us like, hey, we have this better technology, we are more likely to just want to take them on board to our company, right? But what that means is that we get to then extend that more efficient technology across the entire production scheme that we have, across all of this like huge manufacturing capacity we have for EVs. We thought that that was such like a huge benefit on the outside of the house, which they weren't able to claim. Like when they wanted to say that we're going to lose out on one small company bringing like a competitive edge to the market, when we as China can now have like that competitive edge across all of our manufacturing, like on the global scene, on the global market for EVs. Furthermore, they tried to tell us that like, yeah, it would be bad for EVs to merge these companies as it would increase the cost of EVs, and they told us like you would have like these cartels and monopolies, and that makes it hard for competition. We just think that like selling a ton of cheap cars is probably the most profitable thing to do in this debate, and we don't really care like if these EVs are going to go up a little bit in terms of like parts they have to buy from the Western economy, when it means that we get to have like a much cheaper, more efficient production line as a whole for like the entire rest of the manufacturing process. We think that there are other markets out there which were able to like sort of offer a different competition to China, but we think at the point where we're able to sort of like once again like expand this like efficient technology over like our entire framework, that was probably going to be better. Okay, a substantive push now on why we get better domestic outcomes. For framing, we've already told you that like there are foreign and domestic companies in China, and that China is currently losing market share, and that results in them doing things like cutting car costs. So why do we actually get better domestic outcomes when we sort of like merge all of these production companies into one? We've told you that we retain state control domestically, right? When you are able to like negotiate and like these mergers, when you are able to like legislate more and like put in more policy and like have better chains of accountability, which means you get like and we also get more efficient and productive, more efficient production. We have a competitive edge, which means we have like more global market control. What that results in is that the CCP now is able to turn over this like production profit in their domestic market. What that looks like is literally just being able to offer more jobs to like their citizens. Is like having more like people demanding EVs from their economy, and therefore like more people in their country like being happier. Thank you.
Alright, thank you very much to the second affirmative speaker for their final remarks. Just before second neg, I'm going to dash out and get that what I was talking about. Hopefully this can all be cut in post, so I'll be right back when we magically arrive to the second negative speech.
Do you have to do it? Is blue?
Oh, sorry,
What's the color?
Yeah.
Nice. Color it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop charging it. Yeah.
Oh, actually.
All right.
Oh, wait, I also think it's this.
Yeah.
Magic return. Thank you very much to the second affirmative speaker for their final remarks, and I'd now like to welcome up the second negative speaker to continue their team's case in the debate. Kiki.
Am I? The submit to this so I can see all of you.
How come? You mix this session over.
Having a look.
I'm shut down.
Alright, let's go. All of this team's material on effectiveness and on dependence is hinged on the one mechanism of economies of scale they never adequately addressed. I'm going to poison that mechanism and bring this team down with it. Let's firstly address that, then let's address the issue where we can win on sanctions and where they have nothing to say. Firstly, on whether or not this will in fact be effective, they have broadly one claim, which is that you get economies of scale, and that means that you're better, you can increase your independence, etc. There are a number of reasons this fails. Firstly, I think it's quite likely you get diseconomies of scale for the reason that, firstly, your bureaucracy increases. The CCP is famous for terrible involvement in these things. Think of the recent Evergrande crisis, in which the second largest housing firm in China collapsed in on itself, despite being a monopoly, despite having all that, because it was so reliant upon that bureaucratic infrastructure, because it had to communicate at every point, and because the CCP has other concerns that often mean it influences these firms to act poorly, so the CCP often tries to save face, which is why it hides reports, hides mandatory reporting conditions that enable these companies to actually act fairly. It's why it often clears the path in favor of companies that might be bad and would otherwise be outcompeted, because it wants to make sure that its own investment is protected. That is incredibly bad, and it occurs towards diseconomies of scale. Secondly, their material upon economies of scale, I think it's tied towards broadly two things. Firstly, technology, and second, sort of equipment and getting sort of faster plants, manufacturing plants. I think firstly, it's unclear that the technology is compatible. That's something they haven't explained. They never proved it. But secondly, most of the analysis here is actually tied towards manufacturing, which occurs sort of at decent economies of scale, or at the same economies of scale in the status quo. Because for this to be true, you have to believe that each one of these firms had their own manufacturing plant and it would be more efficient if you combined them. This is untrue. These firms already share these manufacturing sort of arenas for the reason that, one, this is a relatively new industry, an industry without capital, so they don't have the actual money to have bought these things up, which is why they're reliant upon existing plants and existing technologies. And that secondly, it's just a cheaper way to do it. if their case is true and this makes things much more efficient, the free market would allocate in that way in order to make sure these things are more efficient. So they do not explain that they in fact get economies of scale. I think it's pretty reasonable to believe they get diseconomies of scale, and their only real mechanism is untrue. The second problem with this analysis is it's just not important. Economies of scale make things cheaper for the company, not necessarily the consumer. And particularly in an industry where these markets are likely to be monopolized, as we explained, this does nothing to ameliorate the damage that will be done towards consumers. Because which are the sorts of companies you're going to combine? It's companies that all occur in one rural area, right? Because those are the companies that are probably most similar. Those are the companies that are the ones that are easiest to sort of put together, because they likely have the sort of offices within one another. And what that means is there are quite likely you get things like regional monopolies that mean that even if these things are in theory more efficient, that never translates towards consumers. And here's where I think it is just laughable weighing from this team. This is about as China, which means we're thinking about the people who live in this country. We're not thinking about the strategic interests of Xi Jinping. We're thinking about the billions of people who have to exist and want to make sure that their products are cheaper, want to make sure that they actually have alternatives. Let's now get towards what we provide in terms of whether or not this will be effective. I'm going to introduce some new substantive here. 3 broad reasons why this will be ineffective. Firstly, it's much harder to enter the markets now, and that is particularly important with regards to EVs, because it is an emerging industry. It is one that is developing very rapidly. So you want to ensure there is active sort of new entrances into this market, and that in and of itself cultivates and betters competition. And it's now much harder to do that, because instead of fighting against 100 smaller companies, you're fighting against one conglomerate that owns every part of the supply chain. You can never enter that market without working with them. Second broad reason, there is less incentive towards to open up to new markets or to go to new places. Because if you sort of conglomerize a certain area, your incentive is to juice them as much as possible. Whereas if there is already a ton of competition, it makes a huge amount of financial sense if you're a new firm to go to a new area and target them, because you don't have to deal with that. Thirdly, it's quite likely this stagnates the industry, because this team doesn't understand how the CCP subsidizes these firms, which is that they subsidize firms based on which ones are the most innovative and which ones are the best. So you likely get a huge amount of innovation on our side, but on their side, when there are only a few companies, not only do these companies already know that they're going to do it and so don't have to push for innovations, but also that they need the money far less, right? Because they already have so much more of it, so they don't have the incentive towards developing these things. So, in terms of effectiveness, they have one thing to say: we flip it, we prove it's wrong, and we give you more reasons that completely destroy it. Let's now turn towards their analysis on dependence. I think broadly this fails for a number of reasons. Firstly, this amount of dependence is far worse under a few big companies, because now you're dependent on them, right? You're dependent upon those companies to succeed. And I would feel much more confident erring on the side of diversification in this industry. As we've already talked about with regards to the Everground, it is much more important to have a huge amount of firms to avoid one firm that is like a quarter of all of Chinese EVs failing due to some structural issues. We will be ameliorated from that. Why is it likely you'll get those structural issues? Firstly, this is an emerging industry. You don't know which ones will be the winners, because that is not something that will be decided, and you have very little data in order to pick which ones are going to be good in the long term, because it is emerging. Secondly, dependence is, I guess this is the second problem with dependence. Dependence is conditional upon these firms sort of losing or other firms being better at it, but I think there's not a problem. If the West is selling cheaper EVs in China, that is a good thing for Chinese people, right? That is not a harm that they're able to point to. This is not about what is in the best interest of these firms or the CCP. But secondly, it's unclear that China has a problem right now. And what they had to prove was that these things were likely to fail, and I think that's not the case. Because for the reason that, one, they manufacture the most EVs right now. They have an enormous advantage. I think at best that implies there is not a very significant problem here. The last claim they make is, well, it is often difficult to regulate. Obviously, this is much worse in their side when there are a few big firms, because think about the bargaining power in that arrangement, right? When there are a few big firms and China is reliant and dependent upon them to succeed, you cannot let them fail, you cannot regulate them. They have a huge amount of coercive power over you to make sure that the government operates in a way that is less effective. Obviously, when you have lots of small firms, the bargaining power is much more in the government's favor, regulation works much more. But secondly, regulation is far more opaque in enormous companies, because they have a huge amount of bureaucracy, huge layers of things. It's unclear if you regulate the top, it'll filter down to the bottom, but a smaller company, it's much more difficult to hide that sort of information. So, on the only real chance they have of winning this debate is absolutely crushed.
Let's now go to the second question about whether or not you'll face sanctions, where only we can win. I think we provide a set of reasons as to why this is the most important consideration in this debate. There are three of them. Firstly, that when you face sanctions on this, you can't get the products that are necessary to make these things in the first place, because the cobalt necessary to make the vast majority of these cars is already monopolized by a series of German firms, by a series of other firms in other industries who got that first mover advantage because they had a huge amount of capital because China was still developing. And now, if you face sanctions from them, the prerequisite they need, which is logically prior to all of their analysis, doesn't occur because you're never able to get those things in the first place. But then secondly, this hurts the rest of the debate outside of just the EV market, which is a much broader impact. Because if you face sanctions in other contexts, that harms a huge amount of people. That means that you can't do things. And lastly, it means that these firms are ineffective. You don't get the sort of strategic power this team talks about if you're not able to sell those things. So why are sanctions incredibly likely? Firstly, they give us this reason when they say that China wants to expand its strategic influence. Who stands against that? It is Western countries who do not want to do that. But then secondly, you now have to compete against these Western firms, which is enormously bad. And we explained this is just empirical, that Germany has promised to engage in this. This is not up for debate. This is a debate that's settled. You should engage.
Thank you very much to the second negative speaker for their fine remarks, and when they're ready, I'd like to welcome the third affirmative speaker to conclude their case in this debate. Hear, hear.
That's interesting music from I appreciate it.
Normally having like Wolifson songs like every time like a speech starts, you just play like 30 seconds of a song.
Someone said round one, a team got up and played Taylor Swift every time they warmed up.
That's nice.
Round 6 will do that, yeah.
Let's go back to like the first debate that we ever did, and let's think a little bit about how actor debates work. Let's consider what the actor of China in this debate actually means, and the way that we are actually supposed to engage in this debate. Because we think there are a couple of things that China wants. We think there are a couple of things that have been missed by this opposition in terms of how we actually like engage with this actor. Because like primary and obvious, and like we hear this at one end, it is the claim that like China is not the CCP. I'm going to beg to differ because I think that it's really, really apparent that the Chinese Communist Party controls like the vast majority of manufacturing in China, of production in China, controls like the economic policy that has set this like the precedent for the aggressive economic expansion that is in the best interest of China to create dependency that allows it to control the West. Obviously, like the interests of China are not like whether the people there can afford like super cheap cars, even though we get that anyway. Obviously, they're about an aggressively expansionist economic policy getting as best as it can be. This is what we were able to offer you. This is the reason that we took this debate. Three things in this speech. Firstly, jokes too. Firstly, just like why vehicles get cheaper. Secondly, and like why obviously that makes China more competitive. And secondly, why we're just like able to both internationally and domestically become a more assertive power. Okay, so firstly, just on like this idea of like why vehicles get cheaper, because I think we hear a lot of like particularly uncharitable response from this opposition about things like how like efficacious and how good this production is going to be. Three things under this: firstly on consumer costs, secondly on monopolies, and finally on efficacy. Actually, no, jokes, efficacy first. Okay, they tell you a couple of things about efficiency. They tell you about things like bureaucracy that are going to be a problem. They tell you about things like compatible infrastructure. I just don't think these are things that we need to worry about very much. At the point at which we told you at Stan about how these mergers and acquisitions were going to, like, you know, basically create an incredibly powerful and, yes, monopolizing body that was able to, like, access the capital to do things like, you know, redo their infrastructure, to do things like, dramatically and aggressively increase their production so that they were able to produce way more cars, way more cheaply at lower cost to them, with a way better supply chain that was able to, like, by the way, knock out kind of like quite a lot of the harms that they wanted to bring you about, like, manufacturing parts. Like, I think that it was just not particularly charitable. We think that, and also, like, on bureaucracy, we think it was just, like, obviously the case that this looks like a company merger being facilitated by the Chinese Communist Party with the express purpose of creating really, really good, really, really fast productions. Obviously, it was not in their interest to weigh it down with bureaucracy. They were not a stupid, party. They obviously realized this was not something that was going to take them in this debate. Secondly, on, like, consumer cost, because I think this is just kind of, like, two weird claims that come after each other. Firstly, selling a shit ton of cheap cars is just, like, obviously the most profitable way to do this, right? Because it locks other people out of the market. This is the way that China becomes competitive as a producer and a manufacturer. And it's literally by, like, locking out small companies from the market. It is by, like, aggressive domination of the market of electric vehicles and producing as many as they can, as quickly as they can, at a lower cost to them, and selling them, at low cost. This locks out other people. This means that they are the most, like, viable power. This was obviously the path that was going to take. So even if we cared about, like, consumer costs, which we tell you doesn't really matter in this debate anyway, because it's still, like, beyond that it stopped people from buying electric vehicles, it doesn't really matter how much, because all we care about is this, like, big profit margin that allows us to continue to expand. We tell you we're probably likely to get these cheap costs anyway. Secondly, though, on monopolies, I just don't think this is worth, like, a lot of my time in this speech. I think we do, like, quite a good job of proving to you, A, why, like, monopolies are, like, to an extent likely to happen in a way that's really beneficial, both for consumers who want to buy electric vehicles, but for, like, nations in the West who want that, like, you know, obviously want the environmental benefit of having electric vehicles, and most importantly, because this is an active debate for China, who is able to get exactly what they want by, like, developing and expanding the industry. But, like, it probably is just enough to say, again, like, obviously become competitive by lowering prices, and also just, like, by the mechanism that we give you at standard, the control that the CCP exerts over this production and manufacturing process. Obviously, we are able to regulate this to an extent. We don't think this is going to be so harmful that it's going to block other companies, that it's going to be so harmful that it's going to provoke the kind of response that this opposition wanted to claim. So moving on then to the second question in this debate, and probably the more important one, because we think that this just, like, weighs everything out. Oh, actually, no, joke, sorry, before that, let's just, like, whip some stuff from Stan, by the way, in terms of, like, how we were able to get, like, better production that we think just, like, wasn't responded to. We told you 4 things, not 1. We told you economies of scale, this was true. We also told you that you concentrated your shareholders, you shared good technology, and you got better supply chains. I just think it was important to remember that before you moved on. Okay, now, let's talk about sanctions, and let's talk about tariffs, because I think this was, like, I just don't think this was something that was going to happen in this debate, and even if it did, I just don't think it was going to have any impact on China at all. Okay, like, I think 4 responses to this one, I might lose count. First one, it's just, like, really unclear as to why this is the tipping point, right? Like, I felt, like, obviously, China has been aggressively doing, like, crazy economic stuff for quite a while now. We don't think that they have been severely sanctioned to the point where it stopped them from being really economically successful. I don't know why this was, like, this particular policy was going to piss Joe Biden off so much that he was just going to stop anyone buying anything from China and, like, permanently cripple their industry. We think that obviously, like, China was just a huge, so second response. China is an enormous economic power. It is extremely dominant in the global economy. Huge amounts of our supply chain, like, of other nations' supply chains rely on China. It was extremely weak. It would be, like, really hard for those countries to like, sanction China to this extent because A, it makes China angry and now China can stop producing things and sending them to you, which fucks you over. But B, because, like, obviously they just didn't want to disturb this relationship. This was internationally bad for them. Second response, even more important. If it is true that Western companies sell, like, parts to China, which it is, and which is their own analysis about things like Germany selling parts, when, like, obviously this is true, it's incredibly unlikely that those companies will accept sanctions. Two, like, situations here. Firstly, Western companies that manufacture and sell parts would like to manufacture and sell more parts to make more money from China. This is obviously going to be better when you have a really huge bloc that is able to do this more fast, like more quickly and more efficiently. This is really good for them. Second group of people, EV companies who want to engage in the merger for all the reasons that we told you at Stan about why it was so incredibly beneficial. What we told you this meant then was that they were probably going to use this lobbying power that opposition spent so long talking to us about to do what was, like, effectively a really good thing for China, which was to prevent them from sanctioning these companies, was to prevent them from, like, taxing and tariffing, like, the shit out of China, because it was obviously going to be really bad for them if they could no longer sell the literal reason that they existed to the biggest consumer of the product that they made. That was a really weird economic decision. That was an economic decision that was never going to be made. It was unrealistic for this opposition to claim.
you that. Again, we tell you that like they bring you a couple of other mechanisms about like, oh, people might lose their jobs, so like there'll be political pressure. Again, like let's just do some weighing here, speaker. We just don't think that like the loss of the jobs of like the loss of like a couple hundred people's jobs in a factory who work in like Germany was going to be worth more to A, the factory, and B, the government of Germany than like the huge amounts of trade that they did with the biggest economic global power that was rapidly expanding that you needed to be nice to, because it was probably going to continue to expand even more. Like obviously, we think that this team has accepted that it is in China's interest to expand and to create these dependencies. We think that it was like there was no way that countries were not going to be so completely terrified of like the economic backlash that we're going to get, and that they were going to ever prioritize like their domestic laborers who were like white, like blue collar workers who didn't care about over like their huge profit margin. Same like analysis also applied to like the CCP and like domestic companies in this debate. Okay, final thing in terms of like the domestic economy of China, I think a lot of this is just like whipping a shell, right? Because we tell you that like obviously we just give you a way better domestic economy. We tell you that like a bunch of really good things happen when you are able to increase production. If you are able to like create if you are able to consolidate, there we go, all of your companies into one, you're obviously able to like expedite your production process. You're able to expand more, like both literally geographically in China to build more factories and make more cars and hire more people to make those cars. You're also just able to like expand more globally. You're able to annex more companies, continue to grow your power. This also creates lots of domestic jobs. Obviously, this is really, really good for your economy. Obviously, this is incredibly beneficial. So for all of that, what you should believe is that we were obviously able to create a huge dependency that was able to allow China to continue expanding its economic power. This was the win condition we set up at first. This is the win condition we met. So proud to have.
Thank you very much to the third affirmative speaker for their final remarks, and when they're ready, I'd like to invite the third negative speaker to conclude the case and the debate. Thank you.
You need an extra table then? I'll be fine. If I have papers in the right order, so that way I can. Those feels like. Ooh, okay. That is unrelief, that's fine. Give me 1 second, I'll just stop my phone. My phone just crash again.
No, not the first phone crash kind of mid-speech moment I've had. So.
Okay, all good. We ready?
Yeah, whenever you want.
Good? As said at both first and second, we need to get Chinese EV prices down. But also noting the info slide says prices are falling, then say what we do to keep it falling is already doing. We need one big company. Like obviously Eco 101, like this is not obviously what very good. Obviously in the rare cases where it makes sense for companies to merge, they always do it anyway. What we're talking about in this case, the Chinese government forced these companies, heavily incentivizing them to merge in cases where otherwise economically would not make sense to do so. Obviously what we stand for on side negative is the free market fundamentals and urban markets that made China able to grow massively in the past 30 years and become very strong. All we know when China recently stepped away from that has caused economic problems and so forth and gone down the path of side affirmative. I think it's quite clear in this debate. You stand for reasonable good market fundamentals, you stand for competition, you vote side negative straight away. But yes, firstly before I get onto like, our stuff about sanctions and then markets stuff, I first want to discuss that brief issue about like, well, how we should interpret this topic of actors-wise. Obviously, no earlier comment wrote as CCP, now it's wrote as China, probably a slight difference there. Also, it's not like as Australia, it's not as Labour Party. But anyway, it doesn't matter because obviously we're going to debate on their terms if they might win anyway, but also it means if you believe our characterization has that would make us win even more in those aspects. So, firstly, in terms of why we win, well, quite clearly, I'm going to our kind of push. We explained to you very clearly that that when companies, and they try and push back this by saying we get Germany doesn't care about their jobs of car manufacturing, that's half their country. Obviously, the politics incentives locally to not lose jobs when you lose factories being shut down probably means people care a lot about not losing these industries. Probably means that actually they do care a whole lot about having tariffs, etc. When they see China making unfair practices, hardly bullying those aspects, we explained why it means you get to high levels of retaliation and sanctions, we make it far harder for Chinese EVs to make it to the markets of the US and Europe. We tell you other markets will be able to make the most profit from, make the highest prices, etc. That explains why that is the case. We actually largely win in those cases. Then try and say the US Germany never sanctioned because obviously they want to trade with China and stuff. Well, no, obviously the US already has sanctions on China in things like steel. Joe Biden really raised tariffs in a whole bunch of areas in some aspects. So I would note China will be very cautious to ensure they don't lose market capacity in this area. I think this big drastic step probably is actually quite bad, quite harmful in those aspects. From the get-go then, that suggests it's a very risky strategy by firms proposing for China. That just means they have to somehow massively make the Chinese EV market way more successful in order to justify it in those aspects. But a further aspect of this is that big firms, they say, will draw investment, and that's really good, and means they'll outcompete them. But obviously note here, this is quite bad, obviously means there's extra obviously means oftentimes these big firms are larger, not because they are better, because simply they're more bloated, they're more forced into subsidies, means it misdirects funds, and also means that they mean Western firms are more scared as they now having Western investment redirected towards these local EV factories, etc. That probably should come later, doesn't much matter, that was our response. That explains why we win in this aspect alone. I think the more devastating aspects is let's go about the economies aspect I want to talk about. Right, because they obviously explain to us that you get a better EV market, because they say you get they have other points, companies of scale, supply, etc., what have you. I'm going to find that all their other claims are aligned on this, so they must win on this issue in order to actually win the debate, right? They need that big industry, yeah. So I know that other stuff about Reliance, etc., suggests they need a big industry to fight off the Western bullies, what have you, and that affiliation stuff means they must win on this issue. Why don't they? No, Archie already gave some responses. I got 8 more. And I think I have to do more than that. Let's get going. So, firstly, on the economies of scale aspects they talk about, obviously these economies of scale exist, but more importantly, right, I think obviously in the short term, economies of scale is just a massive waste of capital, right? You have to do negotiations. How is it going to work? You have to merge factories, merge workforces, merge cultures. This is very expensive time. Note this inherent waste of time that is valuable because EVs are an emerging industry. You have to capture market share. The reason why they didn't capture the combustion engine is the dominant players, the Toyota, and the German and European markets were already in there. It was very hard to capture that market. EVs is expanding, it's fast to get in there, now actually capture that market. That suggests this is actually a massive short-term time waste from the opposition, which is hugely damaging, because it means they aren't able to capture these markets, aren't able to market expansion, which means these companies get locked out of markets. That means it has a really bad time cost in the short term, which means obviously in the long term, they must be able to justify a massive expansion in capacity, what have you. But all this is speculative, aren't the case. Not all mergers are successful. Some cultures are just incompatible, etc. I know they say they have a 300 company in the info slide. They didn't say they want 1 to 2 big companies. Seems kind of weird, all these different companies all merge together successfully. Don't know how it's going to work. Seems unlikely to be actually the case. Mergers fail all the time, right? Look at an example of McDonald's merging with Boeing, now causing Boeing. Anyway, managing down. Not important, not going to go into that. But anyway, so I think that suggests that is quite speculative. Thirdly, if you believe prices are falling currently, just the economy scale is already occurring perfectly fine, they're able to find ways to cut costs and survive, that probably is quite good. And I think the point of this is we managed to flip their economic arguments, their analysis, by explaining that we already actually get economy scale on the outside. Companies are forced to work hard and they're forced to compete with each other, means they have to find new ways to be more efficient, etc. They never explain why they actually get on that side. I think that's quite devastating on those aspects. And then finally, obviously, it comes to supply chains. They say supply chains, those aspects are more efficient. Obviously, you have less supply choice. We only have 1 or 2 big supply chain companies, which means obviously one company has a bad product, you can't choose what to go to. When the quality of the EV is worse, that obviously matters a huge amount, because not just price, but also quality differentiation all matters as well. If you make shit EVs you want to buy, all no one is going to buy them. So that means that quite matters, especially when the US and European markets like quality cars and Chinese EVs have to appear quality to sell to them. That seems quite bad in most aspects. And the fourth final thing to note is obviously we have big companies, at least who rent-seeking behavior. I know state-owned enterprise in China is a huge problem with this. That point means that's quite bad as well, and that means that is quite harmful. That's a lot of explanation to say why you should be setting up all that economies of scale points. I don't really ever get any of that economic target analysis. They make it only bigger. I think we on the outside actually have a better industry in those aspects. So you care about the EV industry and care about all their benefits they want to claim about having a better, stronger EV market. We get them. We get those benefits they talk about. All the thing they say, we actually get on the outside. I think we win on that analysis as well, and that analysis alone. That is quite important. Let's finally then talk about their whole domestic industry and total capital aspects they talk about. All they say is it's easy to control these domestic companies when there's like far fewer of them. A few responses. Firstly, as we told you at Archie about Mato's like 10 more, obviously now a company with one bad exec means punching that one exec is really bad, because it means one company is far more economic damage when you say that people lose trust in that company. That's why Evergrande being $30 billion going bust is really bad, but say a small individual property owner isn't that harmful. And that's really hard. It also means this company has more leveraging power, bargaining power with the government, and that means it's much harder to crack down on those aspects. And finally, note China is worried about this, why they don't want the tech companies in China to be too big, right? Alibaba 10%, they're worried about that. The second thing to also know is China's perfectly capable of regulating 300 companies. There are like 1.6 billion people's internet usage, perfectly fine. Then they can manage the actions of 300 companies. Also, note like regulation about rules and stuff, not like micromanaging every decision. I would say China's government probably isn't the best actor to choose how these companies should behave. Probably let them handle themselves. They'll probably be just fine, right? In those aspects. I think the final thing to say is obviously like, so I think at the end of that, what you must believe is quite clean from the domestic political control. I think China is just able of managing them fine. I don't think they're about to have a revolution currently for the EV companies. I'm sure it'll be fine, and that seems probably quite important as aspects. Let's finally do global foreign actors, right? They give you an intuition push, semiconductors, and obviously China needs to like control these industries, right? Obviously, firstly, semiconductor stuff is because it's like a military technology. EVs are just not that. Secondly, obviously, the issue there is China can't produce semiconductors. China already produces EVs. Until they're going to now get extra capacity on those sides. That seems quite bad. And it's all about bullying and they're like, look up other countries. What does that look like? Not sell EVs to a country? Like, if they just buy them elsewhere, like US or Europe, doesn't seem like it's that bad. It seems like very hard to bully. And also, China can still produce EVs. I guess they can find a way to get around those aspects. But what it means they're able to justify in those aspects are harder. I think China's been able to bully other countries when it has a strong economy, because we tell you what they get on the outside, you have dynamic local EV industry, when you get on the outside, not one giant bloated enterprise on their side. Hence, and it must be, we win on the EV market, we win on the sanctions, and we win on the domestic control, so far so good.
Alright, thank you very much for the negative and fine remarks, and thank you very much everyone for the debate. I'm going to stop the recording now, but feel free to shake hands, cross the floor, be nice to each other, and then please step outside for the deliberation. Thanks everyone.